Hello, my name is Scott Neigh, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about some of the thoughts that I've been having around how cisgender men should be speaking publicly about sexual violence and gender oppression in this moment. So before I get to the substance of what those thoughts are, I want to set a little bit of the context. So obviously some of the context is the upsurge in public attention that these issues have been receiving in the last month, and the increasing numbers of women and other survivors coming forward and speaking about experiences of sexual harassment and sexual violence, and amazingly, the ways in which powerful institutions are feeling pressured to act on these instances of survivors sharing their experiences, which I think is tremendously important. I hope it's something that grows and deepens and is sustained over time. So that's part of the context. And in that context, I, like many people, have been feeling a lot of things. Now, to be clear, I'm not a survivor of sexual violence, and I know that the things that I've been feeling over this period are nothing compared to those people who are survivors. But I am, as is true of most, if not all of us who have gender privilege of various kinds, complicit in the cultures and practices and social relations that produce sexual violence. And in various ways that I'm not going to get into in this video, that complicity is wound up really tightly with various things that I have been thinking about and wrestling with for a long time in the context of my own life. So another part of the context of this issue for me is my conviction that our starting point, our inevitable starting point for acting politically in the world, is acting where we already are, in the spaces that we're already in, the context that we're already in the context of the activities that we're already engaged in. Yes, when we get politically involved in various ways, that changes our trajectory, that can move us towards more collective spaces for acting on different issues, and hopefully that happens, because acting collectively I think is what we need. But whether or not we're in those spaces already, it's where we are now that is the starting point for how we can and should be acting politically in the world. So in the context of that, I think that is the starting point for me talking about speaking publicly about sexual violence and gender oppression, but it's also a kind of a limit on my sense of how important speaking publicly is. So let me clarify that. So my work is, in an expansive sense, speaking publicly. It's making media, it's writing, it's doing various things that involve producing knowledge and throwing it out there into the world for people to engage with or not. And in that context, I think it makes sense, given that that's an activity I'm already engaged in, a space that I'm already part of, for me to be reflecting on how to be doing that better when it comes to sexual violence and gender oppression. That said, I think it's really, really crucial to recognize that among all of the different things that cisgender men should be doing in this moment, speaking publicly is not a big part of that. I mean, there are certainly instances where we should, where it's super important to speak up, to say, yes, I believe this coworker, yes, I believe this public figure, or whatever. But I think in general, what we need to be doing is recognizing all of the other things that we need to be doing, that lots of pieces that have been written in the last month, lots of pieces that have been written in the last 50 years tell us that we should be doing in terms of examining and changing our own practices in the everyday contexts of our lives, in terms of how we relate to and communicate with and listen to and speak to our partners, our families, our coworkers, our friends, and whoever else we encounter on a daily basis, in terms of how we, in small, not visible, not public ways, act to support public campaigns that are being led by women, trans people, non-binary people, and survivors of all genders on this issue. And when we engage with publicly circulating knowledge about these things, again, the most important thing is not contributing to that necessarily. It's really being deliberate about what we read, what we watch, what we listen to seek out and give more of our attention to work that has been produced by women and trans people and non-binary people and survivors of all genders. And then not only that we take that in ourselves, but that we use the little bit of power that all of us have in this social media age to amplify and circulate all of that kind of material. All of that stuff takes up much more space in terms of what we need to be doing right now around sexual violence and gender oppression than considerations of speaking publicly. So that said, I'm still reflecting on how to do that public speech part well, from a good place, and that is what I'm going to be talking about for the bulk of the video. So I've come up with a few different things, and the overarching logic that I've come up with is that kind of public speech about sexual violence and gender oppression by cis men has to be informed by, shaped by, a logic of political responsibility. So it has to be looking at the broader political context, informed by all of this, listening to and watching and reading women and trans people and non-binary people and survivors of all genders, and fitting in these public speech acts to the bigger agenda for change that's defined, that's driven by all of these other people. That has to be the logic of us speaking publicly, whatever the content, whatever the form it takes. And I should say, I'm not going to be talking today about the content of what we should be saying, only the how of it, the logics informing it. And that logic, as I said, is a logic of political responsibility to an agenda that is beyond our individual lives. So what does that look like in practice? Well, I think it looks like a number of different things. So one thing that it looks like that applies to all of us, that is kind of maybe a standard to use when we're thinking about speaking publicly on the issue, is reflecting on whether we are acting from that logic of political responsibility, and to be very wary of acting from a logic that's more about ourselves. So, for example, one way that this often happens is performance. That's performing a particular self that looks good, that looks the way we want to look. And if that is the logic informing our public political speech on these issues, we probably shouldn't be doing it, or we should be doing it in a different way. So that applies to most of us, to making sure that the logic of speaking is about political responsibility and not about just meeting some need that's about us. One specific instance of this that really doesn't apply to very many of us, but that I think is still worth naming, is around taking up space that can be used to make a living or to build a career when it comes to sexual violence and gender oppression. Men should be very, very careful about that and should mostly not be doing that, particularly if there's even the remotest chance that by doing that, you're taking away that opportunity to make a living or build a career related to sexual violence and gender oppression from women or trans people or non-binary people. So that sounds really narrow, but in some ways it's a specific example of something that's a little bit broader that does apply to all of us. So one of the phenomena that happens when cisgender men speak publicly about sexual violence and gender oppression is that we get huge amounts of affirmation and reward and positive feedback for doing not very much. And we get much more of those things than women and trans people and non-binary people do when they speak up and say much the same kinds of things. And a consequence of that is that it can very, very easily turn into a kind of personal branding as a dude who gets it, as a go-to guy when it comes to these issues, even when that is completely undeserved. And so one manifestation of that can be for a certain narrow subset of men, opportunities to make a living or build a career around these things. And like I said, that's something that we need to avoid and resist in a majority of instances, I would think. But it applies much beyond that as well. It's not just people who might be able to make a living doing related things. It's also about how you speak in your activist meeting. It's also about the statement that you post on Facebook and things like that. And it's still important, I think, to resist that branding that can emerge from all of the affirmation and reward and positive feedback that happens. And there are a number of reasons why it's important to push back against that. One is it's something that a lot of men who do pretty horrible things in private have done over the years as a kind of way to protect themselves. They perform this quote-unquote male feminist self in public, and there are countless examples of that and more emerging all the time. So part of pushing back against that form of abuse is pushing back against that kind of undeserved affirmation and personal branding that flows from it. But I think a much more common thing that happens from the, personal branding, the addiction to affirmation of that kind, is that it makes you make bad decisions. It pushes out that logic of taking political responsibility and insinuates a logic of doing things that are really for your own benefit. And that can be about performance. It can be about overemphasizing speaking publicly as opposed to actually, doing the dishes or whatever. And for that reason, I think it's absolutely crucial to push back against that form of personal branding that can happen everywhere. And I have to say, it's not something that I've felt has come up for me much in the last few years, mostly because I think I haven't spoken publicly as much as I should have, or written as much as I maybe should have about some of these issues. But I can think even so of maybe 3 or 4 instances over the last year and a bit where the particular constellation of circumstances has created a moment of feeling that undeserved positive feedback, and it's simultaneously both seductive and really icky. So I think constantly pushing back against that is super important. And the last point that I want to make about how we should be speaking about sexual violence and gender oppression is maybe a little bit on the abstract side, but in some ways I think it's maybe the most important point that I'm making. And that is, we need to be doing it from our whole selves. So what I mean by that is we need to be doing it not from a kind of intellectual recognition of this one narrow issue, but it needs to start from all of who we are, from a recognition that we are simultaneously immersed in social relations about huge numbers of things that organize violence into people's lives and unearned benefit into people's lives in a whole lot of different ways. That there's this all-at-onceness to who we are as people and to the social relations that we're in. And taking political responsibility, acting from a logic of political responsibility, means always working with all of that. And it's messy and it's huge and it's hard. And it's so big that it makes any kind of political purity or performance of being good pretty much impossible. But we need to stay in that. And there are a number of reasons why I think we do. I think it helps to keep us grounded in a logic of acting with political responsibility, where it's always going back to that bigger picture of what are the social relations that surround us, what is the world we're creating, what is the world that creates us, what do we need to do to act with responsibility here. I think it helps us remember that even though speaking publicly is one narrow part of what we need to do in terms of acting from where we already are, it's really only a small part of our whole lives and the political responsibility we need to be taking through all of that. I think it can be useful in disrupting the risk of personal branding, in that because it is so big, because it is so multifaceted, because it is always messy, it will inevitably lead us to a different place than if we like really stay focused on honing saying the right things about sexual violence or whatever, which tends to lead in kind of icky and self-serving ways. I also think starting from our whole selves just leads to better politics. I think it leads to a more realistic and grounded understanding of the world that we're moving through, a more grounded and realistic understanding of the choices that we have to be making all the time. And it also pushes us to learn from political traditions that center this kind of recognition of all-at-onceness, whether that is the Black feminist tradition, which has been one of the most important political traditions in the last 50 or 100 years in North America. And there are also various other strands of politics that do not quite the same but related things, like some anti-racist and feminist Marxists like Sylvia Federici or Himani Banerjee, and so on. And finally, they create space, and I'm not going to take the time to sort of fully go into why I think but for a form of taking political responsibility that is also grounded in our own need for collective liberation, rather than just in some kind of moralistic obligation to others. And I think that that is super important too. It's creating space for our own liberation. It's creating space for joy and pleasure and desire in the world that we want to create. And I think it's very easy, particularly for cisgender men who are like really taking the politics seriously, to fall into a kind of grimness, moralistic grimness that excludes all of that possibility. And I don't think that that is a good thing either. So those are a few of my thoughts on how cisgender men can and should be speaking about sexual violence and gender oppression in the current moment. Again, I didn't really say anything about the content of what we should be saying. I'm not sure that I will be writing anything immediately about that, but I'm definitely interested in hearing from you about your thoughts about how this form of public speech needs to happen, your thoughts about what we need to be doing that go far beyond just speaking in public contexts, and about examples that you've seen of where that really seems like it's been done well and to good political effect. So my name is Scott Neigh, and thank you very much for watching this video. Please check out the written version of this post, which is linked down below, and hopefully I will be back soon with another video.